Good morning. How's it going?
It's going. How's it going with you?
Wonderful. Now that coffee.
Yeah.
I need it. Okay.
Welcome. Come on in. Thanks. Yeah, I know, but there's still a bunch of people trickling in from.
And it is 10. So thanks everyone for coming to the presentation on SMACSS.
All right, so we're ready to get started? You think so? All right. Go ahead and start recording.
I already did.
Oh. So today we're going to talk about Drupal theming with modular CSS. This is going to be a presentation geared towards front-end developers, themers, and people who are interested in CSS. So if you're looking for the Sass or the responsive design, those are down the hall. We thank you for coming to our presentation. I'm Heather Rodriguez, and these are my fellow front-end devs, Nick Grace and Joseph Gunawan. We work for a federal contracting company called JBS International in Rockville. So let's get started. Today we're going to give an intro to SMACSS. What is SMACSS? SMACSS, for those of you who don't know, is Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS. We're going to give you a demonstration of how you can apply SMACSS principles to Drupal, and then we'll talk about any questions that you may have. So let's talk about the trouble with CSS. So, Grumpy Cat says your CSS was awful.
I think she's talking about my CSS actually.
So, one of the biggest problems with CSS is repetition. And I'm sure you guys can all commiserate when you install Drupal out of the box. You're constantly repeating the same overrides, float left, font family. You're defining the font size over and over again. This leads to style sheet bloat. Much larger files, larger files means more code to maintain, but more difficult bugs to find, and also it's a performance hit, right? Bad coupling. So what often happens in Drupal is that your CSS becomes tied to the HTML and its location in the layout. So say you write something, you have an H2 that's sidebar first, info. Well, if you want to apply that class to another part, so another component in your site, it's completely tied to the HTML. It's impossible to make it modular. It's so difficult to maintain, right? Look at this. While this may be clever CSS, sidebar first, newsbox, UL, subnav, LI, active A, what the heck does that do? And how do I communicate to you, if you're on my team, what that does? I mean, if we're going to be writing the same code, we're not establishing a language for us both to collaborate together on. And like I said, your style sheets become bloated. This is the Drupal 7 default markup. Notice that field name, field test, field type of text. There's nothing that's semantic that would give you a clue as to perhaps what type of field this is. And just look at all these divs. SMACSS to the rescue. So what is SMACSS? According to an article in a list of parts, SMACSS is more of a style guide than a rigid framework. It's an attempt to document a consistent approach to site development when using CSS.
So I think it's important to know, like with the SMACSS approach, it's different from object-oriented CSS and some of the other CSS architectures. It's meant to be just a guideline. It's not meant to be strict. So it's meant to be something that you could apply in your teams that works for you and works for your team. Something that people.
Is it like a
to
framework?
work.
It's not framework. SMACSS is a frame of mind. You know, so let's talk about what SMACSS is not, and maybe that will help you think about what we're talking about. It's not a CSS framework. This is not Twitter Bootstrap. This is not Zurb Foundation. It's not a library. It's not a module, not a plugin. It's a theory. It's a way of approaching your CSS. So that
it's a moral models to write to standardize your CSS.
So did you hear, Joseph? It's a mental model in order
Exactly.
to get you to come up with a cleaner and more reusable CSS output. So the history of SMACSS. So Jonathan Snook was a developer in Yahoo Mail. And as you know, Yahoo Mail had a huge team. And so a lot of developers were responsible for collaborating on creating personal skins that would personalize the user's experience. So you could easily swap out, if you wanted to use the UFO theme instead of the snowing theme, your markup is the same, right? Your HTML markup is the same, but he simply wanted to swap out the CSS. So they had to come up with a system that would allow a large number of developers to work on the same project and create a CSS that would be easily swappable. So why use SMACSS? Well, for one, SMACSS helps you design for the system globally. It's not designing page by page by page, which is what happens when you're using just using Firebug to look at, this particular box is, this is the HTML for this box, so I'm going to write an HTML I'm going to write a CSS that's coupled to this HTML. It helps you avoid repetition, which, like we said, is important to decrease the amount of style sheet bloat. It decouples the CSS from the HTML. It's easier to maintain. This is really important if you have large projects. It provides clear documentation and guidelines. So actually the SMACSS sort of manifesto is an ebook that's published by Jonathan Snook, and it's free. You can check it out on his website, and we'll give you the link to that. It's basically, so you establish a method of identifying visual patterns within your site, and you can code to those patterns. And it also separates form from function and supports CSS best practices.
The CSS syntax is going to be same, but the way of using is going to be different.
Can you please repeat your question?
CSS syntax is going to be same, right? Or is it going to change?
So,
Yes.
well, your syntax will change. I mean, so this is a way of writing better syntax, and syntax that can be used throughout your site, rather than, so what we'll do is we're going to launch into a demonstration, and we'll show you some examples of SMACSS.
The old model of sort of the waterfall approach of designing CSS tends to start up in the right, the top left-hand corner from the logo, and you start building your CSS across in rows like that, and you focus on the pages. But what happens is the CSS just gets out of control because you're just focusing on those pages rather than the whole system. And so what SMACSS does is it's an approach to try to step back and look at it as more of a systems design approach to your CSS, and reusing as many elements as possible, then that going page by page and piece by piece, and using this piece of CSS only on this page, which, when the CSS is called on other pages, that code is worthless. It's just adding to the weight of the file. So SMACSS is an approach to try to be a little bit leaner than that.
So what does SMACSS have to do with Drupal? So thanks to Morton DK, the angry themer, now the foundation for Drupal 8 CSS architecture is a SMACSS-based approach. And for Drupal 7, it's already being implemented in Zen Theme 7.5.2. Yay, here's Morton DK. And he's giving you an overview of the SMACSS-based approach and how it's going to be applied in Drupal 8. So I'll let my colleagues talk a little bit about the SMACSS categories.
So SMACSS allows you to, or it separates your CSS into separate rules or what they call categories, of which the 5 are here: base, layout, modules, states, and theme.
And
The-
modules are
yeah.
not to be confused
With
with
the Drupal
modules.
Yeah.
You can think of modules more as components, so a visual component, and we'll show you a little of some examples that maybe make more sense.
And a lot of folks in Drupal development actually call modules components. So in the Drupal world, if you're looking into this, you'll see it interchanged oftentimes.
Component could
and
be like
modules.
UI element itself in the framework, right?
So the base, and you can also think of these as partials. If you've ever worked with SASS or whatnot, you break the files out. Base is generally, these are the defaults. If anyone's ever used like Eric Meyer's reset or Nicholas Gallagher's normalized CSS, this is the reset. It resets your widths and or rather the text sizes, some of the margins. It tries to baseline everything for all the different browsers. Best in really to go with normalized CSS, which is less rigid than say the other resets that are out there. And Zen actually uses normalize. Layout is basically the layout structure, the grid that you're working with, whether it's 960 or whether it's Zen grids,
Of similarity.
or whether it's Singularity or any of these other kinds of grids. This is an example here of 960, but you want to keep your layout separate from, and the overall layout structure in your CSS hierarchy. You want to keep it separate from the other elements.
Can it be used with the Bootstrap framework?
So can it be used with the Bootstrap framework? It could. The challenge with Bootstrap is that Bootstrap actually is the approach is somewhat object oriented or somewhat more SMACSS based. It's not fully based towards SMACSS. The problem with Bootstrap is that a lot of the styles are sort of baked into the elements that are in there. So buttons and navigation boxes, call out boxes. They make it a little bit difficult to customize it so it doesn't look like it's Bootstrap. And the SMACSS approach is to try to do it yourself.
Right, and to try to avoid you having to override everything, because the problem with overrides is that you end up writing these selectors and then creating more selectors on top of that to override those, and then you end up using important all the time, and eventually, we're all familiar with it. It's a big mess.
Never use important. Unless you're working in SharePoint theming, and you have to, which he knows a lot about. So modules, really in SMACSS, this is the meat. This is where you'll spend the majority of your time, and in this file. And this is, in SMACSS, this is the real takeaway. These are the reusable modular elements of your site. These are the carousels. These are maybe your light box styles. These are any product lists. Buttons. These are your call outs. These are your block quotes. These are the little pieces that make up your site and make it unique. And what is somewhat unique about SMACSS is, like here we have Newsbox. That is our parent module or component, but you can extend them. So you could have your Newsbox, and the naming convention in SMACSS uses 2 dashes for what they call submodules or subcomponents. So you have Newsbox dash title, and you'd apply that maybe to your H2 that's in your block, or that's in that Newsbox block. Your Newsbox dash body, maybe you have Newsbox dash block quote in there, or say you have Newsbox. Well, let's say you have an error alert. Everyone's dealt with the Drupal error alert. You could have the parent styles that are used by all of your alerts, whether they're verifications of like a green verification or an error message or whatnot. Say there's a 1 pixel border, that would go into, say, the parent theme, but then the background color changes and the font color changes. If it's a red error or if it's a green verification, then you put that in your extensions. So modules is really the heart of SMACSS, and keeping this kind of stuff separate from your layout, from your default, from the base, and so on. Another thing, states. So states, these are, and the naming convention that SMACSS suggests, and again, these are guidelines, it's not rigid, is and then something. So is error message, is tab active. If it's a JavaScript, there's some sort of involvement with Ajax or JavaScript. So is hidden, is expanded. And these can be applied, of course, to your modules. What Jonathan Stook and SMACSS suggests is that you remove this kind of stuff, you separate it from the actual component itself. And then lastly, the theme base rules. And this is what really Yahoo Mail, they were trying to get at, to separate some of the stuff that they wanted people to be able to switch out the skin, essentially. So if you want to say, if you have a site that you need to customize, maybe you have a different background color, a different look based on the role of the user, then you could swap it out here using or putting these kinds of stuff in your theme file. So best practices that SMACSS suggests: avoid using IDs in your CSS and Drupal. Sometimes it can be hard. Leave that to JavaScript. IDs are too specific. Make your classes that you're putting in, make it semantic. Make it something that's meaningful, not to say, instead of .blue, which maybe the client will say, hey, well, we don't want it blue anymore, we want it red. But you've already got that in the markup. Make it say, .error message. Make it something that's much more meaningful to the actual function or why you're putting it in there. Define the patterns to try to melt your site down into those reusable patterns and look at them as components that can be reused. And of course, as Heather pointed out earlier, decoupling the HTML from the CSS. Don't do .sidebar H2, because then that H2 will or that
is going to be specific for the sidebar only.
And it may not be in a sidebar in the future. So, for example, here, you .box H2. Well, if that H2 changes to an H3 or an H4, you have to keep adding onto it.
It's really
so
bad.
Better, in the HTML below, to just use a class. So box dash heading rather than .box H2. So
Then you could swap it out and make it an H3, an H4, or whatever. But as long as it was a box heading, it can be reused anywhere.
It could be a span tag. It could be a div. You could put whatever you want with it. So overall, the SMACSS approach suggests keep your parent component, your parent module simple. Don't undo your styles. Leave that actually to your the subcomponents or the extensions. So you don't want to get into the trap of overdoing things. So maybe your you've set an H2 style, and then your headline overwrites it. So you get into these sort of weight wars and whatnot in your CSS. So extend, but don't modify the parent. Just have it as an extension. So we thought it's always dangerous doing a live demo, but we thought we'd take a look at.
Alright, so now we're actually going to talk about, so now that you're more familiar with the theories and the principles of SMACSS, now we can see how do we apply SMACSS to Drupal.
And so we threw a little quick site together using the latest version of Zen and created our own subtheme out of it. And I think it's instructive. Everyone has done Drupal theming here? So
I know you guys are just tired. You're like, whatever.
Can I ask a quick question?
yeah, go ahead.
So with Zen, they use SASS for
SMACSS.
SMACSS and SASS.
SASS. I'm asking about SASS though.
Mhm.
For the 5x version, is that baked into the SMACSS re-architecture as well?
Exactly.
Okay.
In fact, this is actually the 5x version that we're looking at.
So is SASS then organized in the same way as the SMACSS CSS?
It is.
Okay.
It is, and you know you'll hear folks like Sam Richard, you know, and others, big SaaS advocates, who are sort of arguing, well, I don't like the SMACSS approach, and it's what's nice about SMACSS is that it is what you want to make of it, so you can adopt as much as you want out of it or as little as you want, and then apply it to SaaS or apply it to whatever workflow you've got, and here in SaaS. You've got the same. It's laid out in the same way. So you have your SAS files here, broken down in the same as the output of the CSS, and of course in the Ruby file, etc.
And then it in the CSS itself.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the CSS just very quickly.
No,
So what,
the
show,
folder
can we
first.
show what the folder?
The
Yeah,
folder.
show what the folders are.
Oh,
like-
yes, good idea. So it's our CSS folder. If you are using SAS, that's the SAS folder. And it sort of mirrors, the output, of course, is the CSS. But if you're not in a SAS, you can use the CSS. You have your normalize file. You have your parent files here. This is your base normalize, and then your styles, the output, which sort of aggregates everything else. And we'll take a look at that in a second. Your components, or what SMACSS calls modules, is broken down here. And they give you a file called miscellaneous. And then your layouts.
That's-
And actually, if you look at the starter kit, you also have right to left. They give you those options, and you can, if you're not, if your site isn't in Arabic or whatever, would be right to left, you can just delete those files.
Somebody.
So going back to our file here, so so you have your components, your layouts, and then the other files.
and so for your themes, where would your theme be?
Where is? So, hold on a second. Sorry, the resolution is all off here. So if we look at the styles.css file, and even very good documentation here. Your base is normalized CSS, and then it imports your layout rules, and in this case, it's the responsive CSS file. The module or components is the miscellaneous file, and here, if you wanted to add on to, so in our case, we've just added on to that miscellaneous file, but you could create your own. Yes.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I don't understand is the last point where you said decoupling HTML and CSS. You're saying create a generic H1, let's say.
Yes,
Okay?
correct.
High up. Are you then saying when in the theming section, if H1 appears in the sidebar, then this is what it looks like? Or are you saying we're going to do that in the HTML?
Excellent question. Do you want to take that?
So
Wanna
I
repeat the
think
question?
the question was this decoupling idea. If you have an H1 and you've already defined it in your base file as sort of a default, and then you go over into your module file, and so the H1 appears in a sidebar. You know, are you styling that H1, or what are you doing with it? Right? I mean,
Right.
is that does that
Right. I mean, are you going to
target the
what color,
H1?
what background color, what
right?
font color? At what point are you doing that?
So what we're saying is, don't target the H1. Give the H1 a class of. So if it appears in that box, you're gonna say. So what is that box called? News box, right? So say news box. So if an H1 appears over in that news box, we're going to give that H1 a class of news box header, right? Because we're going to ignore the H1 part. We're just saying news box header, and news box header looks like it has a font size of this, it has a color of this, or whatever. And that way, so say somebody else comes along and decides that that's not an H1, or maybe it's a P now, or maybe it's whatever. It's still always going to be that particular font size, color, and whatever that we've defined over there in the themes. Go.
So is this mostly happening at like the block level, like when you're placing sidebar blocks and you're doing your content? Because I know that we just did a project and we downloaded this block class module, which made it really handy. But the question is, I feel like there's other times where your development team is like, you know, we don't want to add like classes to everything for you to hook onto. So I'm assuming this is like not so much in the theming framework level, but more in the content like block.
And some of the markup, exactly.
Right.
I think that gets also to your question earlier, is that the idea is that you don't use the Drupal CSS and you add onto the Drupal markup, especially if you're working in 7.
So the block.tpl.php is going to say what the markup is for that.
Right. And I mean, there are ways to change that.
Right, and
John,
we'll be addressing that with the semantic.
But the idea is that you try to separate that from that, and we'll get into some modules. Block class include is one of them. Yes.
I have a little bit of insight into that. If you're using SASS, you have this concept of extends. Okay, so
Yep.
you can define this really nice, generic, like perfect, like
I wish everybody could hear you.
scenario. And then you can define that, and then apply that nice, pretty set of CSS to like maybe a little bit of an uglier Drupal selector to get to the block that you need. So you're still using this object-oriented approach, like you define this like perfect thing, and then hey, we do need to hit this one block, we do need to hit this one thing. So without having to go write PHP to get HTML markup to then get your style, you can just say we'll do it all in Sass. We'll define our thing and then apply it where we need to. So extends is a wonderful, beautiful thing in Sass.
Exactly. Thank you. That's awesome. Normalized CSS.
So
which
this
is the
is your
base.
base.
Here's the layout for responsive. You can see it's not necessarily SMACSS. You know, it is use the div IDs, but it's guidelines. And then the miscellaneous is this file, and we've added some of our own sort of quick styles to this. So and sort of mixing it with some of the Drupal stuff. What we would like to show is how you can start to change some of that markup. And she mentioned the block class module. The block class module is a pretty cool tool. You know, a lot of Drupal sites are sort of built around blocks, views, and nodes. And for all of those, you can control them through a bunch of different contrib modules. And there are also some, John Ferris of Atten Design has done some really great work in how to change the markup with preprocess functions on the theme layer, which is very powerful. So here we just threw some different colors up, some different blocks and whatnot.
So you can tell them that they can think of those as modules.
And we'll have a list in a second of these modules.
No, but I mean that they can think of like the
Oh.
news and latest publications as
Yeah, so
the
these-
components.
So so you see this sort of triptych layout here. This is controlled in your layout, and these would be your components. So this would be, I think this is an info box component that's then extended for info box news, info box publications, and that's reviews. And then it can also be used over there. for those. So, with that said, here, sort of our info box CSS, we've applied that in somewhat of a loose way to this static block using block class. If you scroll down, block class is great. Install it, enable it, and it provides you with a nice little field that you can put your classes in. And these are, in fact, multiple classes that we've put in there. You can also use block class and apply it to blocks that are created from views, that are generated by views. It adds that nice in there, that nice field in there as well. That's how we've controlled these three blocks. Yes.
That actually allows the black class that you set as being included as part of the feature.
Oh, that's awesome.
Can
So
you repeat that?
yeah, so if you're working, a problem with blocks in Drupal 7 is it's hard to export them out through features because blocks are it's like half site building, half content, and they have unique block IDs. And so, gentleman mentions that with Features Extra, you can nest that as part of the features export with these blocks. That's awesome. Thank you. That's very useful, especially if you're working in different server environments. You're working with the dev or localhost dev, staging, production. Very useful because blocks can be an absolute nightmare.
Views module.
So we have also, if we look at some views, here we just played around with some of the font sizes of these. Oops. We added a class to these H2s, news title. So we went to put some styling on the news title rather than these H2. What's great with
View semantic.
this is actually a semantic views module. What's really cool with semantic views is that here's our quick fields that we put into this view. You can actually, in your settings, you can define the element for this field or all the fields. You can define the element and then the class attributes that you want to add to it. Semantic views is quite powerful
That helps cut down on all of the div values.
as well. Keeps it quite lean. And views itself, we did something similar over here in publications. Views itself actually provides you with the same sort of control.
If you go to the field. Yeah.
So if we go into our style settings,
Yep.
we can also define our element for this field and then give it a custom class. We can put a class onto that. And then on the node level, so for this little action thing here, we apply that through Display Suite, which also gives you some control over this stuff. We have wrapped it in a class called film category box. That's our the component.
Go to
And then
manage
it-
display. Show them.
So under manage, well, when you're installing Display Suite, in order to get this, you have to also enable Display Suite Extras, which is here. It comes as part of Display Suite. Display Suite Extras, you have to configure it to enable field templates. And then when you're on that node level, when you manage your display, you can click on, so here's category, here's the field that we want to deal with. You can edit it. We can go to, the default is just empty like that. you go to expert, and we can define our element that wraps around it. It gives you, wrapper. You can apply it directly to the field itself, as we do here. So we give it an element, a div element, and then our classes. So these are some ways of controlling that through the GUI. John Ferris at Atten's written a couple of blog posts on doing this through preprocess functions. So a big shout out to him. He provides, and we'll have a link to this as well in this presentation. He can tell you how to modify your block TPL that you put in your own theme folder, and then the preprocess function that you can add directly to your template.php file, also in your theme folder. And if we look at ours, so we've added a, it's great, you can add these different cases to it. And so here we have block 1, which is the ID of that block. And then we add a class to the wrapper, a custom class to the wrapper. We add or define a custom class for the title, for the H2, and then for the content wrapper that goes around it. And that's how we just very quickly themed.
So maybe the benefit of writing a preprocess function versus using the GUI would be that if somebody didn't have access or to perhaps blocks, to administer blocks, or maybe you want your developers, just to have something in code versus in the GUI, then you could use a preprocessing function where you can control it there.
And this allows you also, the other advantage is exactly, it keeps it in the theme. So it keeps it in the theme files that you can just pop up. You don't have to deal with some of that site building, and just make sure that the block IDs are consistent if possible. Yes, go ahead.
So do you guys ever feel like there is any time where you should just hook onto the natural cascade of a markup versus adding a class?
So is there any time that you can latch onto the natural cascade of the output? Great question. That's what we did with this here, with the alternating rows. It might not be entirely a SMACSS-based approach, but SMACSS is just a set of guidelines, and it's a way of making it work and trying to be lean about it as well. So sometimes you can. So here we have our info box publications, and then .block title, which latches onto just the title of that block, and then the odd rows and the even rows. And there's there are probably ways that you can control that through PHP, the preprocess functions, or even JavaScript, but sometimes that can just be overkill.
Sure.
Any?
Do you want to go back to?
Oh, yeah.
It's closed.
Oops. So some resources. Here are a bunch of modules that some of them that we talked about, some that we haven't. Fences, which is pretty cool. That actually lets you define your element right in the content type, and it cleans up a lot of those extra divs and whatnot. Semantic fields, also we didn't really talk about in Skinner. These are some great modules to better control the markup, so you can start approaching it in more of a
Drupal 7, right?
for Drupal 7, yeah. And then a number of articles. Highly recommend. There's a post on Drupal.org that talks about the overall CSS architecture approach for Drupal 8 and goes in a little bit about SMACSS. And then, of course, Jonathan Snook's SMACSS, where you can get his ebook, and this post by John Ferris over on the Design site about the preprocess functions and blocks.
What was
Yes.
the last module in the previous slide?
Skinner.
Skinner.
S-K-I-N-O.
We'll leave it up here. Skinner.
Yes.
Yes, we will. we're going to hopefully get the slides up onto the CapitalCamp website, but also if you go to, you can go to Joseph Gunawan. I don't know if we can.
This is emergency the address.
It's Joseph Gunawan, GUNAWAN.com/SMACSS.
This is embarrassing.
Yeah, we'll put it. We'll put it
We'll
on.
keep that up there. So if you
Yeah,
want to
we'll,
take,
we'll put it on the
picture.
site.
And in fact, we'll put a comment in the notes. In there. Yes.
This is another useful module. I only found out about it recently, so it's still useful. Sorry. I found out about the menu attributes module.
Oh, menu attributes.
Yep, menu attribute we forgot to mention.
Honestly, one of the hardest pieces of markup to manipulate in Drupal, and it's basically what it allows you to do is add IDs
Mhm.
or rel attributes or classes to links in your menu, like within your menu. So that's really important. And there's a patch even if right now it only allows you to manipulate the A, the result. There's a patch in this issue too that allows you to even manipulate the line.
Oh, that's awesome. So what's the name of the module again?
Menu attributes.
Oh, menu attributes.
Yeah, we
So big
Yeah,
thanks to menu
we
attributes.
already use menu attribute.
I
I
have.
mean, whatever. So we just forget to mention. Thank
yeah,
you.
menu attributes to better control, and yeah, the menus are difficult to theme. So, hey, thanks.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions?
No.
Well, thank you guys for coming. We appreciate it.
Very late.
Maybe.
That's it, right?
Yeah. Think we're good?
Yeah.